Wyoming Territory, August 1883. The sun hung low and hot over the high plains as Tucker Nolan reined in his horse near the edge of the orchard outside Sweetwater. He had not planned to stop. His saddlebags were full, the trail to his ranch lay west, and he had cattle to check before nightfall. But something caught his eye, something that did not belong among the apple trees. A girl, tied to a tree. She looked about 18, maybe 19. Her dress was torn at the hem, sun-bleached red fading to pink at the shoulders. Her wrists were bound behind her around the trunk, rope cutting into skin gone raw. Her face was flushed from the sun, cheeks streaked with dirt and tears. A few feet from her, under the shade of a nearby bush, a baby maybe 1 year old sat quiet in a basket, gnawing on a corner of a blanket. Tucker swung down from his saddle. The girl's eyes widened in panic. "Do not come near me," she said, voice hoarse but sharp. "I am not here to hurt you," Tucker said, hands up. "I am just a cowboy passing through." "What happened?" "They caught me stealing apples," she said, lifting her chin though her lip trembled. "Said I deserved to be left here for the coyotes." Tucker stepped closer. "How long have you been tied up?" She did not answer, just looked at the baby and then back at him. Tucker knelt by the bush. The child squinted up at him, round cheeks red from the heat. "That your brother?" She nodded. "His name is Amos." Tucker stood and pulled his knife from his belt. "Hold still. You are cutting me loose?" "I reckon nobody deserves to be left like this," he said. "Least of all with a baby watching." He cut the rope and caught her by the arm as she staggered forward. "My name is Fallon," she said quietly, brushing her wrists and trying to stand tall. "Tucker Nolan." He looked her over. "You got anyone expecting you?" "No," her voice cracked. "Our parents died last winter. The man who took us and sent me out to work, but when I came back with Amos sick, he shut the door. Said we were not his blood." Tucker's jaw clenched. "Where have you been staying?" "Wherever I could find shade," she whispered. "I thought I could trade for apples, maybe get enough to keep him fed. But I was caught before I could offer anything." Tucker looked to his horse, then back to her. "Come with me." She blinked. "What?" "You need shelter. That boy needs food. I got both." Fallon hesitated, arms wrapped around herself. "Why would you help me?" Tucker met her eyes. "Because someone should have." She looked at Amos, then back at Tucker. "You do not even know me." "I know enough." He helped her onto his horse first, then hoisted the basket with Amos and settled it in front of her. He mounted behind them and took the reins. They rode in silence for a time, Fallon staring out across the dry grass, her hand cupped protectively around her brother's soft head. "You got a place of your own?" she asked after a while. "Ranch about an hour west. Belonged to my father. He passed last year." She glanced at him. "You live alone?" "Just me, a few head of cattle, and an old dog named Bristle." Fallon nodded slowly. "You are not married?" Tucker gave a short laugh.
"No, ma'am."
"Never found the right woman." She looked away again, but he noticed the faint smile tug at her mouth. By the time the ranch came into view, the sun had dipped behind the hills. The little house sat tucked beneath a ridge, smoke curling from the chimney, barn doors open to the evening wind. Tucker helped her down, then carried Amos into the house while Fallon followed, rubbing her sore wrists. The cabin was simple wooden floors, stone hearth, patched curtains over the single window. But it was clean, warm, and smelled of bread. Fallon stood just inside the door, unmoving. "Sit," Tucker said gently, setting Amos on a folded quilt in the corner. "I will get you both something to eat." She sat slow, eyes roaming the room like she could not believe it was real. He brought her a plate of beans, biscuits, and a slice of dried apple. She stared at it for a moment before whispering, "Thank you." He nodded and sat across from her, watching as she fed her brother bits of biscuit, softening the crust with her fingers. "Your hands," he said, reaching for them. She flinched but let him take one, palm up. The rope burns were worse than he thought. He stood and returned with a tin of salve. "Let me," he said. She did not speak, just held her hands out while he rubbed the ointment gently into her skin. Her fingers trembled, and her eyes filled. Tucker looked up sharply. "You are safe here." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She dropped her eyes and nodded. That night, while Amos slept in a basket by the hearth, Fallon lay curled on the cot in the corner, wrapped in a borrowed quilt. Tucker sat in the chair by the fire, watching the flames dance low. "Why did you really help me?" she asked softly without turning. He stared into the fire. "My ma used to say kindness does not need a reason. But truth is, I saw you there, and I could not ride past. Maybe it was the way you stood so stubborn, even tied up. Maybe it was the baby." She was quiet a long time. "Then thank you for not leaving me." Tucker looked at her. "You are not going back out there." She turned on her side to face him. "What do you mean?" "I got room here. You can stay. As long as you want." Fallon's eyes searched his face. "You would let us live here?" "I would not just let you. I would want you to." Fallon blinked hard. "You do not even know me." Tucker smiled faintly. "I know enough." And for the first time since she had been tied to that tree, Fallon let herself believe in the possibility of something better. The morning broke cool and pale, haze rising off the foothills like breath from a sleeping animal. Tucker stepped outside with a tin cup of coffee, boots sinking into the dew-wet earth. The air held the scent of sage and wood smoke, and somewhere out past the barn, the cattle lowed softly to greet the day. Inside, he heard the light creak of the floorboards as Fallon stirred. She moved quiet, careful not to wake Amos, who still lay under the quilted wrap on the hearth rug. Tucker didn't turn as she came to stand barefoot in the doorway behind him. "You keep a quiet place," she said, voice low and amused. He sipped his coffee. "The land does most of the talking. You just have to listen." Fallon folded her arms. Her hair was still tangled from sleep, and the skirt she wore hung uneven where it had been mended in haste. "I could help with the washing," she offered. "Or tend the garden if you've got one." "I do," Tucker said. "But let's start with breakfast." Fallon's stomach growled before she could answer, and she gave a sheepish look that made Tucker's mouth twitch, with something close to amusement. They ate in the kitchen cornmeal mush sweetened with a little molasses and boiled eggs from the hens out back. Fallon barely spoke, but she watched everything with a quiet attentiveness, as if storing it for later. Afterward, Tucker hitched the wagon and loaded 2 empty feed sacks into the back. "I've got to haul salt and flour from town," he said, looping the reins. "You and Amos are welcome to ride in or stay behind." Fallon looked toward the hearth where Amos sat gnawing on a wooden spoon, then back to Tucker. "If it's all right, I'd rather come." He nodded once. "Wrap him good, wind's sharp down the draw." She bundled Amos in a knit shawl, then climbed into the wagon seat beside Tucker, settling the baby between them. They rode in silence for a stretch, the wagon wheels clattering over hard-packed soil, mule hooves stirring dust. "How far's the town?" she asked after a while. 8 miles. Just a store, smith, post, and a church. Rest is scattered homesteads." Fallon looked out over the rolling grassland. "I used to think towns were full of people who had everything figured out." Tucker glanced at her. "They ain't. I know that now." He didn't press for more. Instead, he handed her the reins as they reached a flat stretch. "You ever drive?" She looked at him, surprised. "Once. It was a plow team, and the mule bit me. These two don't bite. Just keep them steady." Fallon took the leather straps with both hands, posture stiff. The mules plodded on, unbothered by the change. Tucker rested his arm along the back of the seat, watching the way she leaned into the work, jaw tight with concentration. "You've done more than your share already," he said. I don't want to be a burden. You're not. She looked at him sidelong. You don't even know if I'm honest. I know you didn't let that baby go hungry, even when it cost you. Fallon went quiet again, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. By the time they reached Sweetwater, the sun was high and the storefronts shimmered in the heat. Tucker took the reins back as they rolled past the general store. An older man in a bowler hat stepped out onto the porch and raised a hand. "Morning, Nolan," he called. "Miller." Tucker tipped his hat. "Got that salt in yet?" "Came in Thursday." They tied off the wagon, and Fallon stayed close as they stepped inside. The shop smelled of kerosene and dried peaches, and the shelves were lined with tins and bolts of cloth. A bell above the door jingled as it closed behind them. Miller gave Fallon a brief glance, then looked back to Tucker. "She yours?" Fallon stiffened, but Tucker didn't hesitate. "Stays with me," he said coolly. Miller nodded and turned to fetch their goods. Fallon leaned closer. "You didn't answer him." "I did." Outside, they loaded the supplies into the wagon. Fallon took the bag of flour, balancing it with practiced ease. "I used to help at a mill, before everything changed." Tucker nodded once, but didn't ask more. As they passed down the main road, a woman stepped out from the dry goods store, her dress pressed and her bonnet tied neat beneath her chin. She gave Fallon a long, considering look. "That's the widow Hargis," Tucker muttered under his breath. "She's got a memory like a fence rail long and always catching something." Fallon didn't smile, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "She looks like someone who's never skipped a meal." They rode home slower, the wagon heavier and the sun stronger. Amos slept between them, his cheek against Fallon's skirt. She held one hand over his back, steady and careful. "You think it's strange?" Fallon asked, not looking at Tucker. "Me showing up the way I did?" "I think strange don't matter much once the right thing's in front of you." She gave a small nod, as if filing that away. Back at the ranch, Tucker carried the salt barrel while Fallon unpacked the flour. She moved like someone who'd done for herself a long time, efficient, quiet, never stopping to ask where to put things. She made cornbread from the fresh meal that afternoon, then sat on the porch steps with Amos in her lap, while Tucker fixed a loose hinge on the barn door. The wind picked up near sundown, and Fallon wrapped herself and the boy in a blanket, watching the sky turn lavender. "You do this every day?" she asked. "More or less." "You ever get tired of the quiet?" Tucker looked over. "Used to." "Not lately." She met his gaze, and something passed between them, quiet, but there. Something that didn't need naming. Inside, Amos stirred and whimpered. Fallon rose, murmuring softly to him as she disappeared into the cabin. Tucker stayed a moment longer, watching the light fade from the hills, the last warmth of it clinging to the land like a promise not yet broken. Fallon stood at the wash basin near the barn, sleeves rolled high and apron damp from rinsing out Amos's linens. The sun was still low, catching on the rim of her cheek and the corner of the tin pail. A meadowlark called from the fence line, its song quick and clear across the breeze. Tucker leaned against the post nearby, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder. "You don't have to do all that." Fallon wrung out a cloth, eyes on her hands. "I know, but it helps having something steady to do." He watched her a moment. "You always work quiet like that?" She glanced up. "Noise stirs things I'd rather leave alone." He nodded and shifted his weight. "There's a fence needs mending on the south pasture. I'll be gone a while." Fallon studied the hills beyond the barn. "Is it far?" "Couple miles. Won't be back till supper." She dipped the cloth again without answering. "You nervous being here alone?" She shook her head. "I've been alone in worse places." Tucker hesitated, then stepped closer. "If trouble ever comes out this way, you take the rifle from above the hearth. You remember how to aim?" Fallon's brow pulled tight. "I do." He met her gaze. "It's only for show most times. But I'd rather you had it near." She gave a single nod, then turned back to her task. Tucker lingered a moment longer before heading toward the pasture, Bristle trotting at his heels. By mid-morning, the wind had picked up, tugging at the laundry line as Fallon pinned a clean sheet. Amos sat nearby on a scrap of quilt, smearing crumbs from a dry biscuit across his chin. Fallon caught the edge of the flapping cloth before it could whip loose, then laughed under her breath. From the road, hoofbeats approached slow. She straightened and shaded her eyes. A rider came into view, a tall man in a faded blue coat, beard trimmed, hat pulled low. He dismounted at the gate without calling out. Fallon stepped forward, her shoulders stiff. "Can I help you?" The man tipped his hat. "Name's Samuel Hart. I came looking for Tucker Nolan." "He's at the pasture," Fallon said. "Fence work." Samuel leaned against the saddle horn. "That right? You his sister?" Fallon crossed her arms. "No," he looked past her toward the cabin. "Place looks better than I remember." "You've been here before?"
"Once.
"Long time ago. Tucker's pa hired me a few seasons back. Branding work." Fallon's eyes narrowed slightly. "You came all this way to reminisce?" Samuel smiled, slow and easy.
"No, ma'am.
"I've got business. Word is Nolan's got a solid herd. I'm looking to buy." Fallon stepped back from the fence. "He'll be back before sundown." Samuel nodded and mounted again. "Then I'll ride the ridge and meet him there. Appreciate the talk." He turned his horse and rode off the way he came, dust curling behind. Fallon watched until he disappeared, then went inside. She checked the rifle above the hearth, her fingers brushing the worn stock. Amos babbled at her from the floor, reaching for a tin cup. She scooped him up and held him close, her heart beating faster than it had any right to. When Tucker returned that evening, his shirt was streaked with dust, and a splinter ran the length of his left palm. Fallon stood in the doorway, arms folded. "You get that fence done?" "Mostly. Had a visitor, didn't we?" She nodded. "He said his name was Hart." Tucker set down the coil of rope. "He's a trader, mostly. Comes sniffing around every couple years. Never stays long." Fallon stepped aside to let him in. "You trust him?" Tucker poured water from the pitcher into the basin and scrubbed his hands. "Never gave me reason not to, but I don't let him too close." Fallon watched him silently, then turned toward the hearth. "I didn't like how he looked at the house." Tucker dried his hands and crossed to her. "You did right not to say too much." She met his eyes. "I didn't say anything that wasn't already plain." He nodded. "That's enough." They stood there a moment, the space between them small and filled with unspoken things. Later, after Amos had been put to bed, Fallon sat by the fire plucking loose threads from the hem of her apron. Tucker sat nearby, boot tapping quietly against the floor. "You ever think of leaving Wyoming?" she asked. He glanced over. "I did once. After my father passed. Thought about heading south.
Arizona, maybe."
"What changed your mind?" He stared into the flames. "Didn't feel right. This land has a hold on me, even when it's quiet and hard." Fallon leaned back in the chair. "I used to dream about California. Someone once told me the air there smells like oranges." "Maybe it does," he said. "But I figure peace don't come from the air. Comes from the people you sit across from." She looked down at her hands. "I never had that. Not really." "You could," he said gently. Her breath caught, but she didn't turn away. Outside, the wind had settled. The cattle were still, and inside that little house, something had shifted quiet and slow, like the first warmth of spring pushing through frozen ground. The next morning brought wet air and thick fog that clung low to the grass, softening the edges of the hills and muting the world. Fallon stood at the edge of the porch, shawl drawn around her shoulders, her breath rising in faint clouds. The earth smelled of wet sage and pine bark, and the silence felt different, deeper somehow, like the land itself was holding its breath. Inside, Amos stirred with a small cry, and she turned back into the house, lifting him gently from the quilted cot. He was warm and heavy against her chest, his fingers curling in her hair as she hummed an old lullaby one she hadn't sung since their mother's voice had gone quiet beneath snow-covered earth. Tucker entered not long after, boots mud-dark, carrying a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Trap caught something," he said, setting it on the table. "Not much, but enough for stew." She nodded, shifting Amos on her hip. "I can clean it." "I already did. Just needs boiling." Fallon lowered the boy onto the floor and watched him crawl toward the hearth. "He's moving faster now. Won't be long before he's pulling himself up." Tucker poured a measure of oats into the pot. "You think he'll remember much from before?" She shook her head.
No.
"And I'm glad. He deserves a start without ghosts." He looked at her then, eyes steady. "So do you." Fallon didn't answer, but she began slicing carrots left from the cellar, the knife soft against the worn cutting board. Later, while the stew simmered and Amos napped in the cot, Fallon stepped outside with a basket of rags to shake out. The fog had lifted, revealing a sky pale as milk. She didn't hear the rider until hooves thudded close behind. A girl, no older than 15, sat astride a dun mare. Her dress was patched along the sleeves, and the expression on her face was wary, but not hostile. "You're the one staying with Nolan," the girl said. Fallon brushed her hands on her skirt. "That's right. I'm Elsie Boyd. My pa runs the blacksmith shop." Fallon nodded slowly. "You need Tucker for something?"
No. Just heard you were here.
"Folks in town say you showed up with a baby and no last name." Fallon didn't move. "They say anything else?" Elsie shrugged. "Some say you're trouble. Others say Nolan's gone soft." Fallon kept her voice even. "And what do you say?" "I say anybody who can carry a baby that far without quitting deserves a place to stand." Fallon's fingers tightened around the edge of the basket. "That's kind of you." Elsie looked off toward the hills. "I've got 4 younger brothers. Ma died 2 years back. You figure out quick how to carry more than you think you can." Fallon stepped down from the porch. "You came all this way just to tell me that?" Elsie gave a crooked smile. "Reckon I wanted to see for myself." "You don't look like trouble." Fallon watched her turn the mare and ride off slow, dust rising behind. She stood there for a long time, then returned inside and sat beside the fire. Tucker looked up from the ledger he was checking. "Who was that?" "Girl from town. Said her name's Elsie." He waited, sensing there was more. "She said I don't look like trouble." Tucker's brow lifted slightly. "You believe her?" "I don't know. But maybe I don't care as much as I used to." He set the ledger down. "You cared because you had to. That's survival. Caring less now, that's living." Fallon traced a line in the ash with her finger. "It feels strange. Like I'm waiting for the ground to fall out from under me. It won't. Not here." She looked up sharply. "How can you say that?" "Because I've seen what it looks like when someone wants to run. You're not running. You're building." The fire crackled between them, and Amos stirred in his sleep, letting out a breath that sounded almost like a sigh. "Tucker," she said after a moment, "you ever think about what comes next?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Like what?" "Like waking up and knowing where you belong. Not just for the day, forever." He met her eyes, and something in his face changed like the last of his guard slipped down. "I think about it every time you open the door in the morning." Fallon's breath caught. She hadn't expected the words, not like that, not from him. But there they were, plain and without decoration. She stood slowly and crossed to him, her hands still faintly smelling of carrot tops and wood smoke. He rose to meet her, and they stood close, the firelight setting a soft glow around the edges of their shadows. "This isn't something I planned," she whispered. "Neither did I," he said. But he lifted his hand and brushed a curl from her cheek, and when her fingers found his shirt front, they stayed there, steady and sure. There was no need for more words.
Not then.
Outside, the land held still, as if the hills themselves were listening. And in the quiet warmth of that small cabin, the shape of something lasting began to take root. The first snow came early, dusting the hills in a veil of white that settled quiet and thin across the roof and fence posts. Amos pressed his face to the window pane, lips parted in wonder at the flakes that clung to the glass. Fallon stood behind him, adjusting the shawl around his shoulders before returning to the stove where the kettle had just begun to hum. Tucker came in from the lean-to, boots thudding heavy against the floorboards, arms full of chopped wood. His coat was damp at the shoulders, and his cheeks ruddy from the cold. He set the bundle by the hearth, then straightened, noticing how still Fallon had gone. "Something wrong?" he asked, brushing his hands off on a cloth. She turned slowly, eyes lowered.
No.
"I just thinking." He stepped closer. "About what?" "About how it's December," she said. "And I didn't think we'd see winter here. Not like this." "You were planning to keep moving." "I didn't have a plan," she said. "Only the next day. Then the next." Tucker looked toward Amos, who was now dragging his blanket toward the fire. "You've got more than days now." Fallon reached for the kettle, poured the hot water over crushed ginger root, and handed him a tin cup. "I've been thinking we should teach him to speak more." Tucker took the cup. "He'll catch on quick. He pays attention." She drew in a breath. "He started saying 'tuh' when he sees you." He blinked, then looked over at the boy. "That's so." Fallon smiled faintly. "I think that's his way of saying your name." Tucker crouched beside Amos and tapped his boot gently. "Tuh," he said, slow and clear. Amos grinned, clapped once, then repeated the sound, proud and loud. Fallon leaned against the table, eyes soft, but unsmiling. "He's never had anything steady." Tucker stood again. "He does now." That night, after Amos was down and the fire had burned low, Fallon sat at the table with a length of muslin stretched between her fingers. She worked a needle through it with steady hands, threading small, uneven stitches in the shape of a leaf. "You sew often?" Tucker asked from his chair near the fire. She didn't look up. "My mother taught me on scraps. I used to piece together doll clothes for another girl's baby sister. I don't know why I remember that." Tucker leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Some things stay, even when we don't expect them to." She was quiet for a moment, then lifted her eyes. "I've been thinking about staying." His breath caught slightly, but he didn't move. "You already are."
"I mean more than that," she said.
"I mean building something here. For good." She set the muslin down and folded her hands. "If that's still what you want." Tucker rose and crossed to the table, standing beside her. "I've wanted that since I saw you holding Amos like nothing else mattered." Fallon looked up at him, eyes wide. "You never said." "I didn't have to." She stood slowly. "I need to know this is what you want. With all its weight." "It's not weight," he said. "It's shape. It's what makes life fit right." He took her hand, calloused fingers rough against hers, and held it with care. "Fallon, I want this home to be yours. Not just a place you're in, but yours." Tears welled, but she didn't let them fall. "Then I'm already home." They didn't kiss, not yet. They just stood there, hands clasped, the fire warming the quiet between them. Outside, the snow deepened, blanketing the hills in white and stillness. By January, Fallon had planted winter greens in the cold frame Tucker built against the southern wall. She wore his extra coat when she went out to tend them, the sleeves rolled twice and pinned at the wrists. Amos had begun toddling, clutching a leg of the table for balance, and letting out cheerful squeals whenever he managed 2 steps in a row. They married the second Sunday of March, under a cottonwood near the ridge. Elsie Boyd brought a ribbon for Fallon's hair, and the town's preacher rode out with a Bible wrapped in red cloth. Tucker wore his father's boots, polished for the first time in years, and Fallon held Amos on her hip as the vows were spoken. There were no grand speeches, no crowd, just them, the land, and the wind moving low through the grass like a promise. Afterward, they shared bread and ham on the porch, Bristle curled at Tucker's feet, and Amos asleep against Fallon's chest. That night, after the baby had been laid down, Tucker lit a lantern and brought her to the side of the cabin where a small framed structure stood covered in canvas. He pulled back the cloth. Inside was a cradle, carved and smoothed by hand. "I made it for him," he said. "But it'll hold more than him, if we want it to." Fallon traced the curve of the headboard. "We will," she said softly. They stood there in the lantern light, arms around each other, the cold air forgotten. The future stretched out before them, not in grand shapes, but in small certainties. Another harvest, more steps from Amos, the sound of laughter in spring. They slept that night with the window cracked open to the wind, her hand resting over his heart, his breath steady against her temple. And when morning came, it found them tangled in warmth, safe in the home they had built not from escape, but from choosing each other. They never left the land. The cabin grew room by room as the years passed, and so did their family. Fallon taught Amos's letters on the same porch where she'd once stood unsure. Tucker built a coop and taught him how to hold a hammer. When the boy asked one evening why the stars looked so close out here, Fallon smiled and said, "Because we stayed long enough to see them." They grew old with dust on their boots and peace between them. And every day they woke to the same truth. They had found each other, and that had been enough to turn everything else into home.